York's classic rock, Q1043.
On HBO tonight and tomorrow night, a documentary that the Jackson family estate tried to stop with a $100 million lawsuit against HBO without ever seeing this documentary, so explosive about Michael Jackson, $100 million. And HBO, God bless them, said, no, we're airing it. It is called Leaving Neverland. With me is Dan Reed, the director. He has been here before. Just a short background on Dan Reed. This is a guy who covered terrorists. He's an award-winning director who picked up in the aftermath of the attack on Mumbai and the aftermath of Charlie Hebdo, the attack on the newspaper in France. He tells me in one of these interviews that we did before that he's done with covering the terrorists because on one of these missions on the way back to the airport, he gets caught in the crossfire of terrorism. So he's done with terrorism. What does he do? He takes on Michael Jackson and the story of child molestation. Now, Michael Jackson was acquitted in one case.
He was.
In another case, he paid off his accuser. And we pick up the story, and this is told very methodically. You have two people at the center of the documentary, and I hope you'll get a chance to watch it on HBO. Wade Robson and also James Safechuck.
Yes.
And we go from the beginning of meeting Michael Jackson to the aftermath of what happened. It is devastating. It is explosive. And after watching it, I just said to myself, how can you argue with these two men? How did this come about? Why did you pick this topic? How did you get to talk to them?
Well, I tripped over this. It was something that came out of the blue, out of a conversation I had over breakfast with a television exec in the UK. And we were talking about what are the big stories out there that I could use this, the technique of telling past tense stories in an intimate register, through very personal testimony. And the guy's name's Daniel Pearl. He mentioned, the Michael Jackson controversy. Do people really understand what happened? And maybe you should take a look at that, revisit it. And I had no interest in Jackson or in pop music. I had a weird childhood and I grew up without television and without pop music. And so this wasn't a story that I had any prior interest in whatsoever, but I commissioned a researcher, Faisal Qureshi, to go out for 3 weeks and just dredge whatever he could. And one of the things he came up with was a reference in an obscure blog forum to this court case, Wade Robson and James Safechuck suing the Michael Jackson estate. And I'd never heard of these guys before. I didn't know who they were, whether they were credible or not. And I thought, well, that's interesting because these are new. I was aware of Jordan Chandler and Gavin Arvizo. These were new guys. Let's take a look. Let's maybe call their lawyers. And I began pulling that string. And, here we are today.
So Wade Robson was 7 years old when he says he was first sexually abused by Michael Jackson. 7 years old, and it lasted 7 years for him?
Yes, from the age of 7 to 14, I believe.
James Safechuck was 10 years old.
And that lasted for about 5 years.
Now, herein, the controversy comes because both of these men, now in their 30s, in sworn testimony before court said, no, Michael Jackson never molested me. This never happened. They explain in the documentary, both of them, that Michael Jackson told them, if you say anything to anyone, I will go to prison for the rest of my life and you will go to prison for the rest of my life. But it was more than that. This, from the boys' point of view, when they were boys, they loved him.
Yeah. So this is what what's really difficult to understand, and this is one of the things that I hope the film will bring to a very wide audience, which is a deeper understanding of child sexual abuse and how it goes down, in particular when it's a grooming scenario, in particular when the predator is someone in the family or a close family friend who has access to the child over a long time. And this is what we were talking about on Oprah in the recording back on Wednesday. This is what we were discussing in Oprah's amazing discussion. She brought together a load of survivors, and we had Wade and James on stage, and it was all about this. How can we get people to understand that with child sexual abuse, often there is a deep attachment between the victim and the abuser. There is also shame, and there is also, as in the case of Jackson, there's also fear, and there are threats. But the primary thing is to understand the love and the attachment, because that's what really drives the secret, the secrecy, the silence. The awful thing is that children often don't disclose to their parents, because the parent will ask, "You must tell me if anyone does something wrong or bad to you." But the child isn't experiencing it as a bad thing. The child is experiencing attention, love.
And as an expression of love, that this is, they both said that Michael Jackson told them, this is the way you express love. It not only your documentary, Leaving Neverland, on HBO tonight and tomorrow night in 2 parts. There's a big commitment you have to make watching this, but believe me, you'll make the commitment. You not only get inside the mind of somebody who was sexually abused as a child and why there is silence and a hesitance, well, not even a hesitance, you're just not going to come forward. What this did for me for the first time was take me inside the mind of a child molester.
Right. I mean, yeah, you glimpse through James and Wade's accounts the pattern of what Michael did. And I believe there were other children who fell victim to this. And the whole film, the 4 hours in 2 parts, as you say, is about understanding why Wade Robson changed his story. Because he told one story while he was in love with Michael and while he loved Michael. And that love still resides somewhere in his heart, and he's spoken about that. But it wasn't until Wade had a son of his own and realized what a defenseless, vulnerable little soul this was, and began to imagine somehow Michael Jackson doing to this little boy the things that he'd done with little Wade at the age of 7. And that just blew his mind, and he began to ask himself questions.
And his life started literally falling apart to the point where he couldn't even function. And he didn't know that this was the reason why. And actually, experts say, not just child abuse, but if you've been the victim of abuse as a child, when you might be able to get through your life just fine, up the point where your child turns the age where you started experiencing this abuse, that's when it hits the fan.
Yeah, exactly.
And I saw that with them. Now, what is interesting about, we're talking with Dan Reed. He is the director of Leaving Neverland, which has drawn a $100 million lawsuit against HBO. They tried to get HBO to not air this, but it's airing tonight, part 1, and part 2 tomorrow night, and of course lives on forever on HBO and the platforms. You hear from the children, they're not children, but they're speaking.
I call them the boys, I can't help it.
But their voice is so clear that you do think of them as children when they take you back through this history of the entire relationship. And it's graphic. And it's really hard to hear and to see their faces. It is extremely graphic. It's not for children. It's going to be really hard for you to watch this to hear this. And you also hear from the family members, because everybody says when they hear about the charges of sexual abuse on the part of Michael Jackson, well, how could the mom have allowed that child to sleep in the bed with Michael Jackson?
Mm. And that's another question that the film sets out to answer. And, most parents, myself included, are utterly baffled by how this could happen. And you have to understand that Michael groomed the mothers and the entire family. He dazzled them with his warmth, his kindness, his generosity,
his friendship.
And
they were special because he made them part of him.
He made them feel very special, the mums I'm talking about. At the same time, he whispered in the little boy's ear that they couldn't trust women, that women were evil and women were, not to be trusted. And so Jackson was basically isolating both Wade and James from their families, isolating them from their mothers, while being the mum's best friend. He both Stephanie Safechuck, James's mum, and Joy Robson, who's Wade's mother, felt that they had a unique friendship with Michael, and that they were truly special, and that they understood him as no one else understood him, and that he was this lonely, tormented soul, and that they could somehow save him, And I think that's why they kind of were blindsided and just felt that Michael was this innocent soul, and it was fine for little Wade or little James to be in his bed every single night. And that's the tragedy. Joy Robson says when Wade reveals the abuse to her, she turns to him and she's in floods of tears and collapsing. And she says, "How could you not have told me?" And that's one of the saddest things I've ever heard, because children don't tell.
And imagine, I can't even imagine. I don't know how you live with that as a parent. I don't know how you live with that afterwards, and how the child goes forward with that relationship. Because no matter what your parent does, you still love the parent, but you don't necessarily like them or are able to maintain that relationship with them. The Jackson estate, again, the Jackson family, they're saying, look, these guys, they're just out for money. And in fact, they sued for money. What's your response to that? That this is all about the money, that this is why this is happening now, and that they're lying. They're just out for the money from a dead man who cannot defend himself.
It is all about the money. But it's all about the Jackson estate's money and the Jackson family's money. And that, in the real world, that is the asset that exists. Wade and James haven't made a penny out of the estate, and they haven't made a penny out of this documentary film. The Jackson estate has a vast income, several hundreds of millions of dollars a year, I believe. And they, unsurprisingly, are fighting tooth and nail to protect that cash cow, which is Michael Jackson's reputation. It's all about the money has always been their go-to argument, and they've always denigrated and thrown scorn at little children who've tried to come forward and get some kind of justice. So there was Gavin Arvizo in the criminal trial, and there's Jordan Chandler, who was paid off at the age of 13 to the tune of more than $20 million. One wonders why.
That stopped that court case, $20 million. $20 million, so the court case wouldn't move forward, settled out of court.
So all we're hearing coming from the Jackson camp is liars, 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 and money, money, money. Now, Wade and James took the estate to court because they weren't involved in the documentary at the time, because they thought and they believed that the court system is the place to hold an entity accountable when that entity has caused them harm. And this is what they argue.
And how much did they sue for? So
this is one of the pieces of pseudo information that the estate has been hawking around. There is no figure has been mentioned at all. So that's just made up. I believe the figure of $1.5 billion was the estimated worth of the estate. That's not what they're suing for. They're suing to get their story out there. Now, when you're successful in a civil suit, there are damages involved, because otherwise how do you know you've won? And how do you pay your lawyers? But they're not primarily out for money. They're out to put on the record and hold to account in a court of law and get recognition for their story. That's what they want to do. They want to put the facts in black and white on the record. And of course, this documentary is part of the same agenda, which is to get the truth out there.
Did you expect the fallout that came with this $100 million lawsuit when you were finished with this? And this debuted at Sundance, right? It just debuted at Sundance.
Yeah, so the premiere, the world premiere was at Sundance.
I mean, it just a month ago.
Yeah. End of January. Sundance was extraordinary. It's the first time that Wade and James, when they got up on stage, they got a standing ovation at both screenings. And this was like a spontaneous, like a massive standing ovation. And they had tears streaming down their cheeks because they almost were baffled and disbelieving because they're so used to getting insane amounts of abuse hurled at them and being called liars. And suddenly here was a room full of people who just watched this movie and were shouting, I believe you, and applauding them. And they just didn't know what to make of it initially. And then I think that was a turning point in their lives because they realized that, at last their story was going to be heard and that people were receiving it with an open mind for the first time.
What do you hope to come out of the documentary Leaving Neverland? You can see part 1 tonight on HBO, part 2 tomorrow night, and it'll live forever on the HBO platforms. But you, Dan Reed, the director of this explosive documentary, what do you hope to come out of this?
My hope for this, and it's not a documentary about Michael Jackson, and my aim was never to topple Michael from his perch as the king of pop. My aim in telling the story about these two young men, or two little boys at the time, is to document a story of grooming child sexual abuse thoroughly and credibly, and to create something that a lot of people will watch, and that anyone who has had that kind of trouble in their lives will be able to use as a reference point, as inspiration, and point to and say, look, that's why I was silent for so many years, or that's why I could never tell anyone, or that's what Uncle X did to me. I want to create a reference point for people to kind of rally around when they've been victims of child sexual abuse, or someone in their family has. And I want people to be inspired by Wade and James and their courage in standing up and telling the story in the face of withering opposition from the state, the fans, etc. And I'd like people to say, well, if they've had the courage to do this, then surely I can confront my own demons and maybe break my silence.
And is there any advice at all you can give to parents so that we can make sure these aren't our children, and if they are, that they feel safe in coming forward?
Well, so the first thing is your child isn't going to tell you, right? So don't rely on your child to tell you whether something bad has happened, because they won't see it as bad. But I just want to quote Bill Warren, who's the lead detective, the LAPD detective leading the 1993 investigation into Jackson's the claims of child sexual abuse. And he said, and this is a guy who's been involved in over 4,000 child sexual abuse cases. He's retired now. And he said, look, Dan, if anyone pays more attention to your child than you do, and anyone seems to like your child more obviously and, lavish more praise and attention on them than you do, you have a problem.
Wow. Okay. Dan Reed, extraordinary work. Leaving Neverland. You got to see it tonight on HBO, tomorrow night on HBO. 2 parts, 2 hours each. I've never seen anything like it. And I'll be back in a minute with more Q104.3.
New York's classic rock, Q104.3.